In your YouTube videos, it seems that the plight of minority workers is uppermost in your mind. Is that assessment correct? How precisely would you help minority workers?
Yeah, well, yeah, black men are, I mean, that's a tragedy of our state. It's not the budget deficit, it's not taxes that are too high, it's not the other things that we're looking at, bridges that are built or not built. It is the problem of just what's north of here. You know, it's black men that have been encouraged to come to our state in the 1940s and 50s and 60s for sometimes for factory work and sometimes for union busting. And then now that these men are here, a lot of the factories have closed, and now we've got them segregated in an area with police force keep an eye on them, and they're a wonderful, I'm using that sarcastically, criminal justice system that destroys people's lives one after another. And I'm going to say right now, the Journal Sentinel, please take a more active role in this issue. You know, there are a lot of other issues certainly that are important, but there's no issue greater in our state than taking care of these men and their families. And you want to know how to reduce the budget, you bring these black men into their work with their families. I mean, you know, these guys have jobs. Now education improves. I talk to MPS teachers, you know, 30, 40 students. We have a parent-teacher conference. How many parents show up? Okay, maybe 15. How many fathers show up? Maybe 2.
Well,
So how do you get them jobs?
How do you bring them into the economy?
Well, for one thing, they are in the economy. And I've changed my mind on this a lot. I've spent a lot of time in the Central City since last August, walking the streets, talking to guys. I go by myself, and a lot of times they say, well, what are you doing here? Aren't you afraid? And I say, well, because you've got my back, right, sir? You know, you're going to make sure that nothing happens to me, you know, and there's a little bit of joking going on, you know, jocularity. But, you know, I want to know from these guys' mouths, are you going to work? And if you are, how are we going to make this all happen? You know, sometimes we've got the gold teeth, the tattoos. You know, do we want these black men living next to us? You know, are we willing to say, do we want these men living next to us? I think the answer is no. And I think right now, no matter what Dr. Martin Luther King said in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, right now our state is not ready for integration, residential integration. So now we have people who are poor in a segregated area. How do we bring them in the economy? Number one, I'm throwing out the old idea of chasing jobs by white-owned businesses, which is what the traditional pattern has been in our state. Black men work for white-owned businesses. Businesses have some difficulties. We lay these black men off, and they're back. And so I tell them, I said, I will do nothing as governor to promote a white-owned business, for you to work in a white-owned business, unless you can do it with your own college degree, with a CPA, you know, that you can just jump at a pretty high level and be successful. Because there are a lot of black men who are successful in our state. I know many of them. Congratulations, thank you. But there are a heck of a lot, tens of thousands of black men who are not in the economy in the way we would like. So the short term is not to chase jobs, because don't compete. Black men do not compete well against white people, Asian people, and a lot of Hispanic people. And I think I'm the only candidate, probably in the United States, that's going to say that. So let's stop that whole charade.
Not competing well because of lack of educational attainment, all those reasons?
It could be anything, you know. Does somebody want a black person working next to them? You know, that's a question. Do I want a black man who has a felony conviction and is not married and has 6 kids working in the stall next to me? That's a good question. And I have to ask myself that a lot of times. But that pretty much is what it is. Black men are not wanted in the state. I think if we did a poll and said, who wants black men out of this state, I think we'd get a pretty high, you know, if people would be honest with themselves, do they want black men in the state? Probably we would say no. Now, I do want black men in the state, and my dad was one of the few white people going door to door in the 1950s when black people came here and welcoming them. Black male employment was one of my dad's biggest issues he had in his whole life. He worked with Brother Booker Ash, and he was just incredible with that. It took me a while to come on to it. So now with that said, we have black men living in segregated places in this state. A lot of these black men already are working. They have jobs. And the jobs they have are generally in the cash economy. They're painting a neighbor's house. Of course, they probably make $40 for painting a whole house. They're cutting someone's grass. They're fixing cars. You go in the central city, you see cars jacked up like this. I said, what are you doing? Well, I'm fixing my neighbor's car. You know, it's cash economy. And one day, probably a couple weeks ago, I was walking down the street, you know, and 3 black men were sitting there in the shade, and you know, obviously they're doing some roofing. So I said, "How you guys doing?" I forgot it, you know. And I said, "Well, what would you do?" They said, "Well, we need jobs." I said, "But what are you doing?" "Well, in the meantime, we're roofing." I said, "You've got a job. You are working." And they said, "Excuse me?" I said, "How can the state now support what you're doing? Instead of saying, take you out of there, where you're obviously successful at some level, and pull you and spend tens of thousands of dollars retraining you and saying, how can we say you 3 guys now can have that business? Now how can we encourage that business?" And that's what I want to do. Of course, that can be done with groups all over the state, but I am not in favor of spending tens of millions of dollars to bring big corporations in here and begging people like Harley Davidson not to leave.
Can you expand on that a little bit, though? How do you support those roofers? What does the state do to get them a job or expand that job?
Well, there is a I hate to use the word moral and politicians in the same sentence, but there is a moral aspect to this. Can I go now and say to the state of Wisconsin or individuals, leave the government out? You know, how can we as individuals now begin to support this business? You know, even saying it in a terribly maybe racist way. Do you want these guys living next to you, or do you want them successful where they are? Well, let's have them successful where they are. Things that they need, for one thing, they need money. They need money somehow. Now, can money be wasted? Yes, it can be wasted. Maybe give, you know, the guy says, I need a truck. He says, I'm using my car keeps breaking down. If I had a truck now, even an old pickup truck, I now can do a better job doing roofing. So he needs a truck. And I'm just guessing now. I'm sure his credit stinks. I'm sure he owns nothing, and I'm sure he probably owes $50,000 child support. So at a certain point, it is, someone has to blindly say, we will use a different way of judging who's going to get a loan than the normal way. Because this gentleman will not be able to come with a nice form filled out and say, I have these assets and you will give me a loan against these assets. Our loans now have to be a loan against a human that now we believe this person will take this step. That is the investment. It's not a traditional way where you've got a car you can have a loan against, a house, equipment, and those things that also does not work in the central city. And I'm also a big believer in cooperative business cooperatives, and the corporate model, the sub-S and the regular corporate ideas are not workable, and I don't want to pursue that. I'd rather have 30, 40 guys in a 2-block area say, how can you pool your resources, create an organization, and then how can the state help that organization? The state is full of retired people. I'm 51 years old. I've got a few more years. I talk to retired people all over the state of Wisconsin, retired engineers, retired carpenters, retired welders. Could you give a few hours a week to help this group that wants to form a cooperative business now and start creating a relationship with maybe 3 guys in this group? I see that as being real. I see that as happening, that people can say, I'm retired, I'm 70 years old, but I've got 10 more good years. I want to start helping out.
I think I get you. I mean, you're talking about homegrown economic development in those communities instead of importing jobs.